Welcome to the Exposure Part 1 video lecture for Art142 Introduction to Digital Photography. So let's start off with what is exposure? Exposure is the amount of light which reaches your camera's sensor or film, and it's a crucial part of how light or dark your images will appear. So often it can refer to how many photographs you've taken, i.e. how many exposures did you make of this light setup, or how many exposures do you have left of this roll film. So the word exposure can have multiple meanings, but it refers to the amount of light that reaches your camera, sensor, or film. When someone asks, what was the exposure for the photograph? They're specifically looking for the measurements of shutter speed, aperture, f-stop, and the ISO. So looking at the details of what made up the components for you to create the image. Sometimes they also may want to know a little bit more about the light setup, of course. When making a photograph, we want to have the correct combination of shutter speed, f-stop, and how does that look on a photograph? So when we think about the correct exposure and the correct combination of ISO, shutter speed, or f-stop, we are looking for an image that feels bright, just bright or dark enough, that both the shadows and the highlights have the most natural and comfortable look. So theoretically, a photograph should have no lost highlights or shadows, so there should be detail and nothing lost. And it looks as possible to real life. Now, the camera isn't an eye, and it shouldn't substitute the eye. It is a device to capture light reflecting off surfaces. We are really looking for the range between light and dark values to be fairly even. Sometimes people get a little creative with their exposure. A lot of times this is complemented with a conceptual theme, so this image is actually fairly dark exposed. There's not a lot of details in the shadows. Again, another image that is fairly dark. Now, it may have a more conceptual reason for why this image is exposed this way, but we're primarily going to be focused this semester is maintaining and understanding how to create a correct exposure. A lot of times, images will be processed with a very weird color hue or too matte looking, so the grays are actually singing as opposed to the colors. A lot of times photographers may choose to overexpose or to have too bright of images. Now this is a style choice, but this is not reflective of a correct or accurate exposure. So you may want to shoot like this on your own, and that's fine. But keep in mind, we want to know that we can do a correct or accurate exposure. So when we have a strong portfolio, we're looking for jobs that we can showcase that we know the basics of photography. And also, if you spend so much money on a wedding dress and there's no details, I would be personally fairly upset. So we're going to talk about manual camera functions. So when we were shooting with film, it was simple. We would preview through the viewfinder, and the camera would average the scene out through the viewfinder. We'll talk about exposure readings in the next lecture for exposure next week. And it would there would be film that we would put in, and we would have to set our ISO up first, and then make adjustments on the shutter speed and aperture and how to manage those both out. And if you've taken a film class with us here at Phoenix College or at any of the community colleges or in high school or even at other opportunities like Phoenix Center for the Arts or Intersection or the new Phoenix Darkroom Revival, then you may be becoming a little bit more comfortable with how to create an exposure. Now, digital cameras, there's way more options, and which can get us to be a little lazy by just shooting on auto and having the camera to decide for us. Remember, we're smarter than the machine. We can tell the camera what we want. So there's more exposure readings, more reasons, more ways for the camera to tell us if something is correctly exposed based on their determinations. There's semi-manual modes like program, shutter priority, or aperture priority. But we're going to be focusing on a full manual mode, which can be a little complicated, but it will be the emphasis for this class. We're going to control the camera in full manual mode, and it gives us the most accurate exposure. If you don't know how to adjust your camera manual functions, you need to read your camera manual. I paused for laugh. So there's going to be 3 major functions, and we're going to talk about the ISO, which is how sensitive your camera film or sensor is to light. So a low number, an ISO of a low number, will have less grain, it's less sensitive, and a high number is more sensitive and more grain. So a brightly lit scene, like a sunny day outside, you would use a lower number ISO, like 100. If something that's a little bit dark, you would need to use a higher ISO. Now how did this photographer use a low ISO in this scene? Will come from looking at making adjustments in the aperture and the shutter speed. So it's all about light. How is the scene lit? And that's how you can make your adjustments on using your ISO. Typically an indoor scene you could probably do about 400 or 600. Outside 200 or 100. A dimly lit indoor scene 800, 1600, or in a nightclub, you may have to bump it up to 3200. To have that sensitive ISO, sensor, or film, you're going to have to give a little with the grain. And here's sort of a infographic which can explain some information. And getting to know your camera and how it works will be really important. Newer cameras are coming out with really great low light sensitivity. So that's something to think about how and when you're using your camera. The next is aperture. The aperture refers to the hole that allows the light to enter through the camera to the sensor or film, like how an eye will move through dark and light. If you notice, if you're in a dark room, your pupil will be large, really bright room, or outside your pupil will be really tiny. Now, these numbers refer to the f-stop, which is the ratio of the focal length to the aperture diameter. So an f-stop is focal length, aperture diameter. It's sort of a fraction. So the f-stop refers to the actual number, the aperture refers to the hole. Oftentimes, these terms will be used interchangeably. It's a little difficult. So if a number has a open f-stop, so this is wide open, you don't need as much light and it's a lower number. If a scene that's really bright, you only need a small f-stop of f22, a tiny aperture. So this is the blades of how the light is let in to expose the sensor or film. So this is how the light comes in to the camera. It's a little complicated to think about. A smaller number is a larger aperture, and a larger number is a smaller aperture. So I like to think of it as sort of being reverse. You would use an f2.8 on a sunny day, not on a sunny day, a indoor scene, dimly lit day, and an f16 on a very sunny day. However, it does, you can see how it affects here if we're looking at these adjustments. So ISO's 320, the shutter speed's 1/200. We'll talk about shutter speed next. As you can see, more light is let in, a medium amount of light, and less light. We'll talk more later in the semester, but the depth of field is controlled by the aperture. So if it's wide open, the focal plane, the focal length is shorter, so things that are closer to the camera will be in focus and everything else will be out of focus in a soft focus, so a shallow depth of field. A number that is larger will have a deep depth of field and more objects will be in focus based on the f-stop. Shutter speed is sort of referring to the curtain that's in front of the camera that stays closed until a camera fires and then allows light to come in. So it refers to the amount of time the camera is exposed. So how much time? So it's in fractions of a second. So this is 1/80th of a second, 1/250th, and 1/500th of a second. And you can see how it freezes motion. So something that has a slower 1/80, it's going to have motion blur. So you can see the chips are trailing as you see it gets sharper. Lower shutter speeds allow more light in because there's more time to be exposed, more motion blur, and has a higher risk of a shaky photo if you are not using a tripod. A higher shutter speed has less light, less motion blur, and a lower risk of a shaky photo. So you can see this example, you can see how the shutter speed changes and when the cars seem to be frozen at the intersection, when to show movement, and so on and so forth. Pulling everything together is the exposure triangle. So it's how you balance the triangle, and the triangle should always be balanced, and how you adjust the need for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And it'll be really hard to kind of understand, so that there is 2 YouTubes you need to watch. The first one talks about the exposure triangle in a probably the best way to understand. And the next one is actually a link where you can practice shooting images online through a web app to think about how you would apply both of them. So watch these videos, have practice with the web app, and kind of get comfortable with using your own camera. Well, I'll see you for our next lecture. Feel free to rewatch, take notes. There will be actually a quiz on this, not this week, but the following week, combined with the exposure to part 2 lecture. Have a great day.